Welcome, Brett, and thanks for joining me today for this Teaching Five session on creating engaging lectures and class sessions. So let's get started. To kick us off, can you start with your top three basic points about how professors can engage students in the classroom?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that these will kind of apply whether you're thinking about an online sort of interactive format, if you do online lectures, or even if you, of course, are in the classroom. I tend to think of our lectures as going somewhere between 50 and 80 minutes, though they can be longer. Obviously, generally speaking, the shorter the better, but we're not always allowed to do that. I mean, I think the first thing to think about is just to recognize that all the research tells us that students' attention is at a premium, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not attentive, and it doesn't mean that they don't want to be engaged. It just means that they actually are waiting to learn in a way that where the teacher is proactively seeking their feedback and their responses, right? So the first thing I kind of always tell people is to try not to tell more than 3 to 5 stories. I'm a historian, so we tell stories and we sort of organize things in that way. But if you're working in other contexts, try not to sort of present or solve more than 3 to 5 problems. Present 3 to 5 new ideas or topics. Even if you know you have a lot to organize and structure, sort of keep it in 3 to 5 groupings of the material for your students. If there are subgroups or other parts, you can always weave these things sort of into 3 approachable sections of the lecture so that it feels like it's organized to your students. I think that one of the things that maybe like loses students' attention is when you have a series of material that you want to teach, you may not know how far you're going to get into that material. And so you go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, without giving the student any sort of sense of how that material is meant to be organized or applied, or how it fits into the broader context, either of the lecture or of the course. And that can be tempting because you want to get through all the material you need to get through, but to again, to just organize it into 3 to 5 subgroups so that the student knows after 5 to 10 minutes that you're moving on to discuss something else. It keeps them thinking about what's next, and hopefully will keep them engaged. That I think is the first point, right? Because as you're structuring the lecture, as you're giving it a sort of skeletal framework, that's always the first place I start. Um, the second thing I think I would mention is that I always try to be as transparent as I can with my students that I love their engagement, right? That this is a community of 15 to 35 people where I would love your feedback as often as possible. I will even tell students, and you may not want to do this, but I will tell students that I don't mind being interrupted politely with questions and hands up so that I know that I am maybe introducing, for example, a term that they don't understand or a concept that's over their head. I tell them that I will reward their feedback. I tell them that I am excited about their feedback, and I tell them that this is not a situation where I am dumping my knowledge into your jar, and then at some point I'm going to test you or offer you a chance to dump the jar back to me, right? It is about engaging and learning in really complex and intricate ways. And I tell them the only way to do that is that I'm sort of the wicked professor at the front asking for their feedback consistently. So I imagine I don't even call my lectures, right? I call them interactive sessions where I say that I will take the lead, but I need your time and your feedback throughout the session, right? Um, and I think that when they start to see you model that, and when they know that you're going to back up those words with actually asking them for feedback throughout the sessions, which I'll talk about in a minute, it really does gather their attention and builds a connection between professor and student, right? I think everybody knows, most master teachers know that trust is really what makes a classroom start to feel like a community. And if you tell them you're asking for their engagement, you seek their engagement, and then you honor their engagement, that's how you build trust with those students that are willing to get involved. That would be my second thing, is just to be as transparent as you can that you hope for and expect their engagement. I guess my third key point would be to think about how you feel comfortable as leader of the community, as lecturer. And I say this because I think if a lecturer feels comfortable, then the students are going to feel at ease as well, right? If a lecturer is nervous, is concerned, has anxieties about what they're going to cover, how they're going to get there, concerns about how they're moving through the material, the students tend to kind of feed off of that and will not feel as comfortable as you hope they do. And so my third piece of advice is just to get comfortable through practice with how the mechanics of a lecture from minute 1 to minute 50 or minute 80, right? So know your kind of cadence in how fast you talk, or how you present material. Sort of think through your timing. If you have 3 to 5 groupings, know how much time you want to spend on each of those topics or ideas. I'll often on my notes, sort of just in the margins, write down the time where I want to be sort of addressing those things. I think it's very common for early teachers to sort of run through material either really quickly or to sort of talk too long about certain aspects of the lecture and then to give other parts short shrift. I think the best thing you can do is to practice your cadence and your timing, to know how long it takes you to, say, cover 4 note cards or 1 page worth of material or 3 slides, to kind of learn that mathematics, that calculus of how you operate. Um, I'll often tell folks, right, that there's a good way to group your slide deck or your material to where you have sort of the things you know you can cover in 50 minutes, and then to have sort of optional kickbacks where you maybe return to slide 4, right? To revisit something or to allow time for question and answer, to maybe add on an extra story that you'd like to tell, or a contemporary connection, if you like, right? Something that allows them to that allows you to fill time if you need to, but isn't going to mean that you end 10 minutes short, which again, is not an efficient use of your time or the students. So, kind of think through timing and mechanics and cadence. There's a whole series of other questions too that you should start to feel comfortable with, whether you're in a classroom or online. But thinking about things like, do you like to be behind the desk or the lectern? Do you like to move around? Do you need to move around? I tend to have a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and so I am constantly moving in the classroom, and at times need to sort of like be sure that I sit still for a while so that I'm not kind of passing the same students 10 or 12 times in a minute, you know? But thinking through, where do you feel comfortable? How kinetic are you? Which parts of the classroom can you kind of float to and spend time where students can still hear you, where you're not blocking the screen, for example, right? Know where you feel comfortable. If you haven't visited the classroom where you're going to teach for day 1, right, do so immediately. Like figure out where you're going to be, how you're going to fit. If the classroom has the stuff that you need, it's pretty common for ODU classrooms for you to maybe even, kind of bring your own tech or your own materials that can sort of help you deliver it in the way you can. Again, in a classroom or even online, right? Like what kind of possible disruptions can you imagine? Each room is set up differently with different entry points and exit points. How can you minimize those disruptions? Think through what kind of notes you're going to use. How are you going to work through the material yourself? Do you need an iPad? Do you need note cards? Do you need papers? Where are you going to sit those papers? Where are you going to rest them? How are you going to look through them? All of those sort of physical mechanics are really important for helping you to feel the most comfortable you can feel. And for lectures that haven't done a lot of that, try a bit of each out and see which works for you, and then adapt what works for you generally into the specific space that you're in, right? I think this matters for online lectures too, right? Where do you feel most comfortable? What room are you going to record them in? What do you want behind you, right? You're looking at yourself in an online lecture for a long period of time. You want to feel good with what you're seeing, right? So know where you feel the most comfortable, the most kinetic, the most sort of where your peak sort of personhood is going to come out, because that's really, again, going to reflect on the students. When they know you feel comfortable, enthusiastic, and engaged, they're going to want to respond in kind. So I guess my third thing is just to suggest that you feel comfortable yourself.
So I really like calling lectures interactive sessions because it frames it as a very different type of engagement rather than me sitting here as a student listening to you lecture at me.
Yeah,
So
I
I
think
really
that's
like that framing.
I appreciate that. I think that's important. I mean, again, if you want them to engage and you want them to follow up on what you're doing, you have to frame it in ways that encourage that engagement.
I also like that you mentioned being transparent, because I will say, kind of thinking back to when I first started as a teacher, I tried to be transparent with my students that there are going to be times where we're going to try things out
Yeah.
because I'm not yet quite into that rhythm of who I am as a teacher. So we're going to try it. Sometimes it's going to fall flat, and other times we're going to be like, "This is great. Let's continue this." And I think being transparent with students about that is also really, really important.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk a lot about the growth mindset, right? Trying to encourage a growth mindset in students. And one way you can do that is just by showing them how you grow or revealing stories in which you had to do some growth, right? Or had to learn something to be better. So I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk technology and let's talk access to class materials because what we present to students in the class during that session isn't everything.
Yeah, I think again, not only so that you feel comfortable and they feel comfortable, but just kind of checking the boxes on for accessibility, right? Pre-check your technology, not only that it's going to work and be functional when you walk in the room, but ensuring that it's equitable for students, right? So can all your students access your materials fairly equitably? Tech is making progress in this, right? But not everywhere. Simple things like recognizing that not all students can access a computer in person in class, right? That many of them may need to be on their phones. That can kind of present new opportunities, but sometimes disruptions as well. So, sort of thinking through what materials you want them to have on hand, if any, being transparent about what you expect from them with those materials. Do you want them to pull them up on their machines if they have them in the classroom, or are you sort of going to provide what they need on a screen? Can they access those materials fairly easily or equitably, right? Are they buried under 5 or 6 levels of Canvas, or can they get to them pretty quickly? I'll always a simple thing you can do is pop the materials for today's session right to the front of Canvas so that they can see them easily and they're not spending the first 5 minutes trying to find what you're looking for. Because as I'll mention in a minute, right, those first 5 minutes are everything. If they spend the first 5 minutes looking for the materials online, that's a wasted time, right? And it doesn't engage them. So kind of thinking through what you expect. If you want them to, a slide deck's obviously really common, right? If you want them to access that slide deck, can they see those slides on a phone? Can they pull them up quickly? Are you going to waste your first 5 minutes sort of working through tech? Because again, that's an inefficient use of your time. Um, I think too here, right? Like thinking through kind of how your tech works with the very limited time you have. So one of the realities of being a professor is that you're probably going to sometimes stack your classes one after the other with like 10 minutes in between. And in those 10 minutes, you're going to answer 5 different questions from students. You're trying to greet people as they come in the door sometimes. You're maybe trying to write something on the whiteboard. You're dropping your last slide deck and opening up your next slide deck, and you want to make sure that the tech works, right? So, I tend to, oh, by the way, you can't always get into the classroom like more than 5 or 6 minutes before the class starts because there tends to be somebody else operating before you, right? So again, just the physical mechanics of all this really matter. You want to be in there ready to start with everything working, your clicker, your iPad, your slide deck. If you're on Zoom, right, making sure all of your engagement tools on Zoom are up and going so that when it starts, you are setting a model that we are going, folks. We are moving forward. There is energy in the classroom. We're not spending our first 4 or 5 minutes watching Dr. Bebber fumble with the keyboard, right? That is not what we want to do. So again, all of this is just some pre-planning stuff that happens outside the classroom that you can take care of. The other thing I would suggest, the other big thing, is to think about what materials you do actually want to pre-post for them on Canvas, right? Are there things that you'd like them to have on hand? And in what media format do you want them to have those on hand? If you're presenting a video, do you want them to be able to access it on their own screen? Or are you going to show it on the main screen? Are there anything are you going to remind them of anything they need to complete beforehand? Any lead-in assignments that are going to help with the interactive session, that are going to give them the material they need to understand you? Pinging them the evening before with an automated email that suggests that to remind them that they need to read X before they come into the classroom might feel a little bit like you're carrying them along. But if you want engagement, right, and the engagement is predicated on having done an assignment before they get to class, I don't understand why you wouldn't take every effort to make sure that they're prepped before you get there. So again, there's no like perfect tricks for like disseminating the tech that you need to students. But I think just considering accessibility and equitability in terms of what they can access, thinking through students with sound and sight mobility issues, making sure that they know where they can get the same materials and that you've provided them for them if they have accommodations or needs. And then just kind of thinking through what you want the students to have on hand so that they're ready at the beginning of the hour in the same way that you are.
So technology can be our friend, but to make technology work with us and for the students, we have to plan ahead.
Yeah,
And I
and the
think that priming, right, is I think what sometimes gets overlooked in the craziness of let's get my PowerPoint slides done. Let's post everything to Canvas, but the priming for how it works to help students learn sometimes just kind
absolutely.
of doesn't get the attention that it needs.
That's really well said, right? That's really well said. And tech, again, right, the more it becomes useful to you, the more little things you need to be sure it works, right? So if you're running polls or if you're running sort of interactive feedback in any way, right, through a bit.ly or something, you want to be sure that all of that stuff is set up and works, because if it doesn't, it causes a disruption. There's no like kind of middle ground there, right? Like if it works, it's awesome and it leads to good engagement. And if it doesn't, it saps 4 minutes of your 50 minutes, and you don't want that to happen. Yeah.
But also, you go to these events and you remember when the technology failed. You don't remember when the technology was spectacular.
Yeah.
So I think students come out of those class sessions the same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but now we're in the classroom setting. Where do you
Yeah.
start?
Okay, so I will almost always sort of frame what today's material is within the sort of context of maybe the unit or the course, right? So on this PowerPoint slide that I sort of pulled from a class I'm teaching on the global history of sport for Monday, obviously you have some sort of like introductory slide, but then you also want to sort of like maybe frame it in terms of like reminding them of their other sessions. So students are often enrolled in 3, 4, 5 classes, right? And they may not remember that this is a follow-up on a previous session or that this is part of Unit X. You want to remind them that this is the unit we're working on, in this case, a unit on nationalism, imperialism, and sport, and we're right snab in the middle of it, sort of using this German example of turn-in, a form of gymnastics, to sort of analyze those dynamics. And it just gives them a quick reminder, right, that this is where we were, this is where we came from, and here's where we're going. You don't want to waste too much time on this, but you often need to remind them of key assignments or things that are coming up. You can pop that on this slide, or you put it on a whiteboard before they come into campus, and they know that that section of the whiteboard is where you put the upcoming assignments for the day, right? I sometimes call this my agenda, getting it out to them. Like, do you know where we're going, where we are, and I'll often offer a minute for questions, especially if there's a big assignment coming up or something seems out of place to them. Again, really easy to do, to slide into every slide deck or to put on the whiteboard before they come in, but to ensure that they know where you're going, right? I think the other thing then, like once this is kind of done, is to sort of think through, like, how do I want to get their engagement right now? So if you want to model engagement, you can't, I would suggest that you didn't speak for the first 20 to 25 minutes before you ask for a question or an open feedback from the classroom, right? So like from the very beginning, I don't even care if it's just like making something up to talk about, right? Like you can ask them how their Halloween was if you'd like, right? Today's Halloween when we're recording this. You can ask them how their Halloween was. You can also suggest, hey, what did you learn from our last session, right? What stuck out to you? What did you remember? Simple callback stuff that asks for 3 or 4 or 5 voices before you get started, that just models that this interactive session is going to require you to be engaged every once in a while, right? I also think that hearing student voices for other students before they sort of get locked into your own just sort of matters in terms of the physical environment, right? Ensuring that like everybody can hear one another. Any sort of summary questions, questions about the homework, right? Bonus questions if you'd like for extra credit, anything that can get them engaged in the first 2 or 3 minutes is really smart. And that doesn't have to be built in the slide deck, right? That can be while you are showing your topical slide or your introductory slide and just reminding them like, where are we going and where have we been? That would be my first thing, right? I think the other thing maybe to keep in mind as you're thinking through the classroom setting is just to consider introducing them to what you will cover or what is expected to sort of be the component parts of what you're discussing. So like if the if you have one slide that sort of shows you assignments and the sort of general topic within the frame of the course, you might have another that simply introduces you to, hey, here's the theory we're going to engage. Here's the type of problem solving we're going to approach. Here's a couple of key terms you may not know that we're going to get started with. And here's the big idea on sports diffusion about how sports move from local places and go global. The big idea part matters in terms of moving beyond a recap and setting an agenda for the day. I guess the last thing I'd say in terms of once you're in the classroom, what to allow for. I think you should always sort of be okay with the types of interruptions where students have questions, thoughts, or want to express an idea, right? Most teachers have been in the situation where you're talking about A or B, and a student might make a connection to C, and though even C may not be relevant to the course, right? It still matters for the student to sort of get that off their chest. There are always, of course, limitations sometimes for really chatty or overly sort of overshares. But I think sort of allowing students to make connections. If it's really common for a student to say, "Hey, I learned about this in my literature course too," and they'll introduce the book that they read that in. And though the book isn't relevant, you're allowing that student to show other students that it's okay to be making interdisciplinary and connections across their learning spectrum. I think it's okay to allow yourself to make tangents too, right? I'll often kind of tell students, do you mind if I just tell you a story here that kind of relates to this, right? Or I'm always making sort of contemporary or relevant connections to history, right? If you're teaching a math class, sort of allowing yourself a minute to just show your students how a sort of math problem might apply in the real world. All of those things can be really helpful just for sort of taking little mini breaks from them hearing you talk, right? Which is, I think, maybe the whole point there. But I think once we're in the classroom, getting yourself set up, allowing students to see what you're doing, knowing where they're going, and then allowing for some of those interruptions is just fine. You might also sort of be thinking through, right, ways in which you could you want to be interactive, so you can use those bit.ly forms or sort of Google polls, any sort of other interactive tech. If you have that and your plan is to use it a couple times in the session, build one of those times into the first 5 minutes so that they know what you're doing with it and how it's going to set you up, right? And you can kind of build that into a recap question or something if you'd like.
All right. And so anyone who's been in the classroom, and you've already showed us some examples of your PowerPoint slides, we know that professors love PowerPoint slides. What are some of your thoughts about how to use PowerPoint slides in a class to engage students?
Yeah, this is like the ongoing question, right? Because this is where their eyes are going to be most of the time if they're not at their own machine. And really, if there's a choice between their own machine and your screen looking up at you and at the rest of the people in the classroom, that's where you want them to be. So, I think that you got to strike a balance between providing all the information, too much information, all the visuals on your slide deck, and sort of encouraging engagement. Because if you have 100, 150 slides, chances are you're going to be rushing through them, right? In a 50-minute lecture, that's 2 slides per minute, right? You're going to be rushing through them. You know, your students might be asking for you to back up and explain something, or back up and let them copy a term or an idea. I think you really want to balance, right? Just kind of how many slides you want in that deck with the time you're going to sort of think to expand on that, the time that you're going to allow them to offer their answers. So just thinking through like the size of the deck is the first thing, right? I think the second thing is, and this is like my biggest teaching trick, and I don't mind giving it away, it's not a secret, right? But just really, I think you can really encourage engagement and encourage them to follow you by giving things like undefined terms, questions rather than answers on the slides, and even like indeterminate information that you're going to provide, right? So like when I plan to spend 2 minutes discussing romanticism in Germany in the 19th century in this lecture, I'm going to lay out 4 or 5 key values of romanticism, but I'm not going to put those on the slide deck because I want them to have to listen to me to figure out what those are. I may provide them in another format later, right? Like on a handout later or after class, but maybe not. I might expect them to simply know what I'm doing. And if I need to write particular terms so that they can see spellings of those terms on the board, I can do so. But asking them to sort of follow you can be done in ways that are sort of embedded into your slides. That I think is kind of important, right? To just sort of there is always a temptation for anyone, student or otherwise, right, to grab the sort of handout or the PowerPoint after class rather than either paying attention or showing up at all, right? And that's a common problem for folks that put out really effective, smart, complete slide decks, is that then it doesn't always encourage your students either first to attend or two to really follow you during the lecture because they know that they have a reference point they can always go back to. And I think that you got to find a balance between allowing them something that they can go back to and look at, with asking them to be with you and follow your thinking in the classroom. I also think it's really good to just use visuals to their fullest effect, right? So for almost every visual I will use, I will simply ask the classroom what they see or what they heard or what they found, right? So that for the visuals, they're not just as sort of something to look at, but they can be something that introduces new dynamics of discussion into the classroom. You don't have to do it again for every visual if you have 10, 12, 15 visuals, but know which 3 or 4 you might want to spend a minute on just asking what a couple of students see. That's one way to encourage engagement. Even if your visual is simply like, again, I'll use math as an example, but like a math problem, right? And if you've got the math problem on the screen, sort of ask them what they see and how they might approach it, even before you get started on explaining the concept. Any sort of visual, you can use a quote too, right? And ask a student what they see in the quote. Any of that will lead to consistent interaction through the session. And again, you just want to build in a minute or 2 here or there. I would say in a 50-minute lecture, which is my sort of preferred format, I'll have sort of those moments where I expect students to talk for a minute or 2, 6 to 10 times, right? So where they're filling about 10 to 15 minutes of the conversation and I'm full on, in lecture mode for the rest of the time. But those are sort of scattered throughout with these types of questions or reflections on visuals that are cued by the slide deck. I think that can encourage the types of Socratic engagement you want, right? You can sort of build questions into your notes as well that maybe aren't on the slide deck, but anything that allows them to start to reflect, engage, and learn is helpful. Of course, open questions are better than closed ones, right? Closed questions make students feel like they're a little nervous to pitch the answer because they could be wrong in front of the rest of the class. But framing those questions in a way that allows for interpretation and simply like accurate, like accuracy and seeing what they see, right, is really helpful. Maybe like the kind of underlying concept there is to is to divest yourself of the idea that you need to lecture the whole time and follow the slide deck exactly as it goes, right? Because that's your plan, and it's your outline. But students will recognize when you want to take a tangent, or when the classroom sort of goes a different direction. That's part of what a learning community does. And you can always sort of say, hey, we'll come back to that if we need to later. Divest yourself of the idea that you need to be the one talking, or that you need to be the one sort of keeping us on track with the slide deck. I would also point out a couple of like common slide deck problems beyond too many slides and sort of having too much preparation. I would say that it's okay to kind of let a slide sit, right, for 5, 6, 8 minutes, sometimes even longer, especially if the concept is difficult, especially if the terms or ideas on the slide are a background for what's being talked about by the professor or the students. There is maybe like a sense in which like we feel like we have to keep going to keep our students' eyes up and looking at us. But really, I don't think that's the best, like most solid and secure way to encourage engagement, because again, you'll motor through 30 or 40 slides and students will forget things. You really want them to be focused on you and not the deck, and on their peers even, and not the deck. And so that letting a slide sit is just fine. Simple things, again, mechanics, making sure your slides are formatted and designed similarly, right? So it's not a distraction for a student when the slides are kind of jumping all around, making sure they're readable and intelligible from all parts of the room. Again, go check your room and make sure that you can see those things. It's very difficult at times to tell that the slides that you're prepping on your 18-inch screen will translate to a 4-foot screen in the classroom. And I guess maybe the one thing that I do see often with younger professors is sort of letting the slides sort of be the crutch for the professor, so that when the professor doesn't feel comfortable, they turn their back on the class and are looking at the deck itself, right? So be sure you have your notes or your iPad so that you are open and engaged physically with the class. And then sort of knowing your material well enough to say, okay, I don't need to be reading these slides or sort of regurgitating what's on the slides exactly for the students. If it's on the slide, you don't need to say it, right? You don't need to, they can read, they can see what's there. You can sort of move along with the supplementary material or the sort of broader engaging discussion that you want to encourage.
So, Brett, I think that last point that you brought up about using the slides as a crutch, I think it is an important one. But I think also sometimes it's not as much as a crutch as much as some maybe, early career faculty, kind of newer teachers think that I have to tell everything that's on the slide.
Yeah.
But you make the point, the students could read the slides, and not having to lecture to the slides can be very freeing, because it also allows you to look at the room and say, oh, they don't get it, or they get it. So I think I think the reliance on the slides, especially when there's so much information that you want to cover that you put on the slides, stepping away from that can be freeing for the faculty, for the professor as well.
Absolutely. And just one other tip, right? Like if you've spent 10, 12 minutes talking about a topic and you do feel like you've sort of motored through a bit of material, right? Before you change a slide or before you move into a new set of slides, right? It's just fine to be transparent and say, here, what I really want you to take from this last 10 minutes is X, right? I really want you to know this. Write it down, highlight it, asterisk it, underline it, right? That's what I want you to know. And then you can move on. And it just sort of reiterates to the student, oh, out of the last 10 minutes of back and forth, this is what I was supposed to pull from that, right? That's not a bad idea either.
And sometimes I tell my doctoral students, another way to get your students' attention is to say, this is going to be on the test.
Sure. Yeah.
Let me remind you, or let's pull this all together because this will be on the test. So sometimes the students will perk up a little bit.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
But you talk about kind of that recap at the end, or pulling the threads together. So when we talk about wrapping up the class, how do you end the class on a high note?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do have to do the work of concluding in some way, right? Because you don't want to, leave the sort of material sort of hanging. And concluding, reminding them of what's important, sort of pulling 3 to 5 sort of key tags, as I tend to do. We tend to talk about conclusions in history, but you may sort of have a different term or idea for how you want to compress that information. But just reminding them of like why they've spent this time with you, right? They've spent this time with you not only to learn, but to sort of understand some bigger key concepts and questions that might fit into the broader understanding of their course. And heck, if it comes up, right, how does it fit into your major or your future career path? Like, why not toss that in there if you see something for the day that might be really useful, right? If a math problem is going to help mechanical engineers who are going to design, particular types of plans, like toss that in there and say, this type of math is almost always really useful for this career path. Those kinds of things keep students thinking, oh yeah, I need to be thinking about the broader picture. And I get that. And as you mentioned, right, when you are creating lots of slide decks for lots of different lectures, sometimes you can lose the plot a little bit too about where you're going and what you want them to learn. So kind of thinking of it that way. I also think exit tickets are a good idea. I don't use them in every session, but sort of allowing students to let you know what's still confusing, what might need revisiting in future sessions. You can often tell that by sort of student reactions to some of the material you're presenting. But there are often things that go very unnoticed by the lecturer, especially when we're in our heads trying to motor through the 50 minutes. And so a quick exit ticket, even if they don't do it in the last 1 or 2 minutes of class, if they have the opportunity to do it after class, if you leave it as a thread on Canvas, let students sometimes anonymously pitch, hey, I didn't really get what you were talking about with that. Like, it was a decent story, but I didn't understand the point, right? And so like giving yourself a moment. That also opens up a window at the beginning of the next class to sort of readdress questions or recap in a way, and can link your lectures from one to the next. You can even sort of whet the appetite for the next session, right? I didn't do that here on this conclusion slide, but like you can sort of say, hey, next time is X, and we'll be thinking through how much fun it is to talk about Eastern European Sokol, which is a version of Turnin, right? So like you can just pitch whatever's coming next in a way that's engaging and helpful.
All right. So, in the spirit of concluding and ending on a high note, what final thoughts or concluding lessons learned might you offer?
Yeah, I think the first thing I always remind sort of junior faculty and young teachers is you just learn through practice, right? You got to do a lot of it to continue to improve. All academics are really smart people. They're all really, really committed and motivated. They want to be great at it from like day one, right? And it doesn't always go that way because we're not always trained as well at pedagogy as we are at our disciplines. And this is why, this program that you put together is so incredibly helpful, because we need to be reminded that eventually a lot of our job is going to be doing this kind of work, right? And it only happens through practice. So don't be afraid to be experimental, as you mentioned, to try things, to tell them you're trying a new thing, to ask them how the new thing went, or if they preferred the older formats you went through. You can vary the types of interactive sessions or discussions or lectures you do, right? To see what works and what doesn't. Borrow and copy from other good people the things that they're doing that are engaging and useful. And don't be afraid to adapt as you go, right? No one is a master educator or lecturer when they start. The best ones are the ones that are constantly adapting to what works and changing their materials to fit that. Maybe a key part of that is just getting good feedback too. It can be really intimidating to have another teacher, academic, authority figure sort of come into your classroom and watch. But if you can tolerate it and you have the confidence for it, like it can be really helpful to get that feedback from somebody else. It usually and often, if you pick the right person, right, turns into like an engaging conversation about things they do that they like, things you do that you like. And it doesn't have to feel like a sort of evaluation of the type of work you're doing. Getting that good feedback from people you trust and even others that are learning at the same level is really helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Brett, for sharing, and also in the spirit of, helping our graduate students, because I think, as you mentioned, we don't always get trained. We're trained in the research and we're trained in some of the other methodologies, but we're not always training our students to be teachers. And for some, teaching doesn't come naturally. So I think learning from others and knowing that you can experiment until you kind of figure out what works for you, I think that is also really, really important. So thank you again. And I appreciate your participation in this teaching series.
Thank you. It was a joy.